Legal stuff, there we go. Right, so this is CRU. I don't know how many of you know CRU. We're a metals and mining fertilizer research company. We now have a new sustainability division. I come from the consulting side, so I run the consulting block in the middle where we do a lot of support for mining finance, including the market studies for new investments, particularly when raising the final bankable feasibility studies. So I was given a very wide remit, so we are going to have 5 almost separate presentations this afternoon. I've been asked a little bit about the super cycle, so I'll introduce our views on whether or not we're currently in a commodity super cycle. Question really about lithium and whether or not there's a deficit in lithium and how long that's likely to last. I personally wanted to talk about rare earths when we're talking about critical minerals and the minerals that facilitate the green transition. Rare earths is something that we're doing an awful lot of work on now, and you know, if you've got a battery but not a motor, it's somewhat less useful. Looking then a little bit at supply chains and how the supply chains are going to evolve. We covered that in the panel discussion this morning to quite a lot of detail. A few more points there. And then finally, where some of the money needs to be spent, so honing in on some of the big investment announcements from US and EU. So what's the context we're talking about today? So it's really important to be aware that the COVID pandemic really is a once-in-a-century change in the economic outlook. There have been downturns over recent years, but this has been the biggest downturn in global GDP since the 2 world wars and the Great Depression. And that means that there's an opportunity for changes to be made. It also means that some of the bounce-back numbers and the percentage growths you'll see are not quite as meaningful as they would be in other circumstances. So just a little warning if I give percentage growths. It's also interesting to look at what's happened to the dollar. It's been the currency of the flight of capital to the dollar. It's been fueled by speculation about what the Fed's going to be doing with interest rates. It's particularly important for us because of the sale of commodities, obviously in dollars. And you can see here what that's done to some of the exchange rates with the commodity producing regions. So if you pick up at the bottom there, the effect on the Aussie dollar, so the underlying cost base for iron ore mines, coal mines, some of the nickel cobalt assets, lithium assets, it's been quite negative for those. Obviously iron ore, Brazil. So moving on to the super cycle, what do we mean by a super cycle? So in a super cycle, we're looking for a situation which occurs very rarely, where we have probably around a 30-year period of time that prices and economic change fundamentally underpins higher prices in commodities. It requires a structural change in our industries. So the question is, have we, after these number of years of high prices, got to the point where we believe there genuinely is a super cycle occurring? So in terms of the macroeconomics, we're seeing a growth from durable goods. So we're seeing people who've been locked up buying new fridges and freezers. We are also seeing that the Chinese, having released their economy more quickly, are seeing the first recovery. And we're also seeing quite strong monetary and fiscal stimuluses around the world to help people spend the money they've saved up by being locked down, for those of us who were lucky enough to keep our jobs, obviously. On the supply side, we're seeing quite a lot of disruptions on the supply side. It's been a difficult period for global shipping, for access to energy, access to labour. So we have seen quite a few disruptions among the assets we cover, and also shutdowns. And when I get to lithium, you'll see that the price environment caused quite a lot of shutdowns in the run-up to COVID. It's also an interesting facet that with the slowdown in supply and the increase in demand of some of these consumer goods, we actually have very, very low stocks in the supply chain now. Could have been due to people not wanting to hold their capital inside goods, but it also means that there's a very direct linkage now between what's happening at the mine and what's happening in the consumer side that before was buffered much more by the stocks. We think a bit of the price surge that we've been seeing has been the hype running up to the COP conference. We know that people were really hoping for some big announcements on the energy transition that would have had meaningful changes in commodity demand, and we think that there were speculators in the markets before COP looking to make money in anticipation of increased demand from that. I don't think we've seen that particularly playing out. So just picking up on two commodities here, the iron ore, which is the one that's got the straight down line at the end there, and copper. So in iron ore, we've really seen a change in the market, and it's not actually so much driven just by the iron ore market. This is a story of Chinese policy, a reduction in emissions, and also the case that the cost of coal mining has gone up, and we've got quite a shortage of metallurgical coal. So as metallurgical coal prices go up, what you have is a movement to ever higher grades of iron ore or substitutes in EAF and in scrap. So here we have the basket price for iron ore, which has really suffered as a result of people struggling with energy costs, struggling with met coal costs, and then only selecting high-grade iron ores into their furnaces. Copper's a more interesting story, very, very lacking in direction as a market over the last period of time. We had a fairly quick return of the copper market to more normal price levels. I've just read our November publication, and we've actually extended our period of high prices in the copper market. And I think if I move on to the next slide, copper is the one commodity where I think you'd begin to be able to talk about the fundamentals of a super cycle beginning to be present. So we do have these excess demand that comes into our battery metals, our commodities, and the energy transition metals, and you're beginning to see more of a supply gap in these. It does begin to support the beginnings of these price cycles, and in copper you've got that price beginning to go up. We were waiting for COP for a much stronger guidance on what's going to happen with EVs, but I think we all know that over the next 20 years we will be moving to more electric vehicles. We will be moving to a greater electrification in our homes. You won't be able to sell a gas boiler in the UK, I think within about 5 years' time, so those houses will be more electrified. And we've also got Chinese policy changes which are driving demand much more strongly or first in the Chinese market. We have quite a lot of ESG requirements that are behind the energy transition, but also behind some of the other changes we're seeing in the market. And it's pushing the supply cost base up. So the cost of mining a commodity is now beginning to go up as you manage your dust, manage your carbon emissions, manage your water emissions, make sure you're not emitting dust into the local environment. And that, at the beginning, pushes the costs up. So we do think that although 2021 has been a year of elevated margins, we think that the costs, fundamental costs in the markets will begin to go up. It's a long-term trend that the cost of mining will increase. But maybe copper is the one now where increasingly there's a chance that the price will be supported by this electrification rollout over time. So I'm going to focus in on lithium very briefly. I've got a few slides to cover here. And the question I was asked is, are we in deficit? And the answer is yes. But I'll talk a little bit about how long it's going to last. So lithium has come from a tiny market, 100,000 tonnes and less. You see it at the bottom, it's called industrial. It's grease and ceramics. It was a very uninteresting, underinvested market, totally stable, nothing happened, capital fully depreciated, no interest. And we've seen this yellow band of demand come in for the e-transport, really take over the market and increase the scale of the market by 10 times over the period that we're looking at there of about 10 or 11 years. And that's really driven a dramatic increase in investment across Australia into new different types of mined assets that can produce lithium hydroxide, lithium carbonate, into the chemical side, in terms of the processing of the chemical materials. And some of the price volatility we saw early in this market was due to mistiming between the mines coming on and the chemical plants being available. and then the demand into the EV side. We think over the coming period, there's going to be a balance between hydroxide and carbonate. They go into different chemistries of battery. So you've got the LFP batteries, which are a lower grade, lower range product, but more resilient, more able to be used in cold climates, much cheaper to make. And then you've got the NMC cathodes, which require those expensive nickel cobalt commodities and which have the longer range. But the two will exist more in balance than we previously thought. We'd originally forecast that the market would go much more strongly across to the expensive NMC high-range materials. One of the other things it will mean if LFP does stay in the market is that Chinese exports of cars are more likely. So the Chinese have got fully depreciated plants making LFP. They have ramped up automotive plants making these vehicles. And if they can pull a Toyota or a Hyundai or one of these other brands that's come out of Asia historically and get customer acceptance in the West, they are really strong competition for the Western automotive companies in terms of providing transportation service. And I'm going to come back to that just a little bit at the end. But as you can see, battery demand very, very strong, and then the balance between the two, carbonate and hydroxide. If we look at supply's been a really interesting story. You've had these peaks and troughs in the price, and that's led to people coming into the market maybe a bit earlier than they should have done, people coming in without the right agreements for offtake. The initial new entrants in lithium thought it was a metal market. It turns out it's a chemical market. It was actually really hard. And so you had idled assets. And now you had the trough in the price, and now you're beginning to have the prices going back up again with the deficit. We have quite a lot of assets sitting in Australia that can be turned back on. And I think the knowledge the market now has about how to use that material, about how to process it, about how to treat it as a chemical, will mean they'll be more successful this second time round. So this just shows what we see coming back in, and also the new supply we see coming over the next sort of year or so. It all means that although there is a deficit this year, we forecast a smaller deficit next year in terms of just the total market size. Prices are interesting, so I'll just cover that quickly. We've got a whole new set of price setting mechanisms now. These are the Pilbara Minerals online auctions of spot cargoes, and they give us a better pricing point of the market of the day, because currently there's quite a mix between contract and spot in setting these prices. It's really shown that all of the trackers of price have gone up very, very high, and you've got a much closer alignment between carbonate and hydroxide than you had before. The gentleman this morning was talking about that hydroxide premium, and that really has gone away now. The market is balanced with all the capacity through the chains to make both of them lined up, and they're very much balanced between the two. So we think the deficit will ease in 2022. Those idled assets will come back on. In the long term, there is still probably a deficit, a growing deficit. But for this next year, we see the prices trickling back down again as that new capacity comes, well, as that old capacity, supply capacity comes on in advance of the demand, which is still being built in Europe and North America. So a very interesting market to follow, always up and down. And always a new story, new commodity, a new region to talk about in that one. All right. I'm going to move on quickly to rare earths, which is a subject after my own heart at the moment, and talk a little bit about China's dominance and what the rest of the world's looking at doing to overcome Chinese dominance. So why do we actually care about rare earths? It's been a Chinese market forever. We've had a few little sort of policy tiffs around rare earths, and then suddenly we had Xi Jinping meeting, I think it was Trump in a magnet plant, and everyone suddenly went, actually there is something going on here. So just a quick overview of how the rare earth market divides up. You can see that by volume, permanent magnets aren't a ridiculously large part of the value or the volume. But as soon as we start to look at what it means by value and what's happened recently, the permanent magnets are the biggest story in town for rare earths. And why do we need magnets? Well, magnets go inside every single motor, barring the induction motors, and they go inside the wind turbines, inside the generators. So the whole of the energy transition, or one of the main technology for the energy transition, requires magnets. And the magnet market is controlled by China. So this is why everyone's interested. And we're now beginning to look at other markets coming in. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So this is what happened last year. We've got a demand for rare earth oxide. You can see over time it's been, it's grown steadily, but nothing dramatic. And last year, quite a bit of demand destruction with COVID, just in that last year before it bounces back onto trend after that. As you saw, though, in the last chart, the value went up at that time. So what are the drivers of our long-term demand? Consumer electronics are very small. At the bottom of that chart, you've got our mixed-up xEVs of all kinds, very important, the wind turbines, and then a little bit still in all the motors that go in your internal combustion engines. So demand expected to grow from about 118,000 tonnes at the moment up to 261,000 tonnes by the end of the period. So very, very strong growth in terms of the underlying commodity, driven by energy transition. So you saw the electric vehicle conversation. This is what we look at in terms of the change in the growth of batteries by type. The picture actually looks exactly the same as the new energy vehicle growth chart, but this is done instead in terms of the neodymium iron boride magnets that we see. Still very much driven by the Chinese subsidies. Chinese subsidies are driving the electric vehicle market. There's not so much in the wind power over there, but very strong long-term growth in China. Maybe slightly longer term. If some of the new policies in Europe come in, we might see some of the growth coming more quickly in Europe. Again, if China is able to build up LFP to an electric motor, the electric motor has the rare earths in it, you export that, you start to get an interesting story in the rest of the world. What's happening in China, though? The font might be slightly small. So first of all, we've got a change in policy. So they're increasingly controlling production and export of rare earths. They've done it before. In fact, if we look back to the electronic revolution when the Walkman came in, they did exactly the same then to prevent the Japanese owning the magnet market at that point. So we've had two major bits of legislation come in, one around production and one around exports, and making clear that the Chinese government consider it a strategic mineral. We have seen on the flip side of that we've got slightly higher quotas this year for exports. So just with that price spike that we've seen, we are seeing a little bit more flexibility for exports, but we genuinely don't believe that if the market starts to invest in assets overseas that they won't pull back that export quota. Because everyone's been a bit concerned about this and because there isn't really any value chain for magnets outside of China, we are seeing stockpiling, and that's very hard to quantify. But we do know that some of the price spiking has been due to the stockpiling of the magnets, and we also know the Chinese government is itself stockpiling inside China so that they have another lever to play on the market. Finally, just straight geopolitical tension. As I said, Xi Jinping had a meeting inside a magnet plant. Never an accident. And you can then start to see other nations trying to develop their own supply chains. So we've got Mountain Pass in the USA making moves to reopen that mine quite quickly. At the moment, the material has to be processed in China, but if they can continue to go downstream, you can start to see a rare earth oxide magnet motor value chain building up in the US. Also, the Australians looking at it in Northern Territories. You've got the Malaysians looking at it with Lynas Group, Hastings Technologies. So you've got a good few of these players coming in now and thinking about investments outside of China. And they might well get financing just to be a hedge against these Chinese this Chinese control and this Chinese policy. So this is the dominance of China. You can see as a percentage at the top how very, very dominant they have been, slightly pulling away with the USA coming back in. That's Mountain Pass, a little bit in Burma, as I mentioned, the Australians coming in as well, but very small volumes compared to China. When we talk about supply chains, this investment and the sheer amount of capital you need to solve this problem when each of these steps all leads to China is actually quite complicated and time consuming, because it's hard to finance one step in the chain without understanding where all the future steps are going to be as well. Supply tightness, and where are the greatest supply tightness going to be? Thinking back into the battery, but I think this is equally relevant to rare earths. What can we do to better understand the battery supply chain criticality? So we're seeing this localization of production, if people can afford it. So moving from a really long, lean supply chain, which the automotive companies have built up over multiple years to absolutely pull out the last cent, to actually, if I can't get a key fob or I can't get a microchip, that's quite a problem, and I need some other way of doing that might need to be a bit closer to me so I can talk to them. But it is a cost to the automotive guys. They need to find new materials, they need to find new suppliers, they need to sign new kinds of contracts, they need to actually understand whole new industries to make electric vehicles. We mentioned a little bit the locational mismatch between, the minerals, which are where they are, then the processing plants, then the downstream. It isn't always obvious how you do localize some of these assets, and we know that China has got a multi-year head start. We also have a very uncertain policy framework. So at any time you make a jump because you believe one particular policy is coming in and then it doesn't, there's a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of our business now is looking at scenarios to try and navigate uncertainties between different policy sort of frameworks that are coming in. We do know that the policies around emissions are getting stronger, and people are managing the carbon emissions the most strongly. That's not news, but there are other emissions, and we know that dust emissions, we know that sulfur emissions will all come under a spotlight once people have figured out how to do how to transfer the information about the carbon emissions up and down the train. Production, adding in other things, is much more easy. We also know that the change in policy frameworks also refers to artisanal mining, to understanding who's working on materials you're buying right the way up and down the supply chain and tracking that. And from a social point of view, it's really important that policies around not using child labour, not using unequipped labour are maintained more carefully than before. So this high transparency we're talking about, I need to know about my whole supply chain. I need to know what they're emitting. I need to know who's working there. I need to have a really intimate relationship with them, whereas before it might have been a purely financial transaction. Has a cost. It has a cost because otherwise I probably or may not retain my skilled workers. Workers are now questioning, who am I employed by? Do I want to be employed by this company? Is it a brand I want to be associated with? But also the upfront cost of actually working out what you're buying and where and what's in it. It's very hard to do an ROI on that because it doesn't have the same payback of the other projects you're looking at for your business, but yet it's mandated for you to do that. And it'll take a lot longer for that to make financial sense. It still needs to be done, but again, it is another draw on the finances these days. The final thing is that the investment points and the trigger points for making these changes are not so much in the control of the asset anymore. Some of it's policy mandated, and you get told what to do and when. And it might be that that doesn't make the most efficient market that you could have had. It might not mean that the cheapest asset comes on. It might not mean that they're done in the right order, because the industry choices over how to be capital efficient over time, which might be a staging of these investments, won't happen in the normal way. And it does mean that there's likely to need to be more government support coming into these markets just to help over this transition phase and just the cost of doing it. So I've got a couple of quick examples here of where it's going to be tricky. Cobalt, It's a very simple chart, but we're up very close to 75% of the world's cobalt coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Traceability issues we all know about, political unrest, the resource nationalism and the cost or royalty costs of dealing with the DRC, the fact that the logistics and infrastructure are not really up to standard for reliable investments, and most recently we've had unfortunately another Ebola outbreak there. But the industry as a whole is reliant increasingly on, or they haven't managed to diversify from this very strong reliance on the DRC. If we look at chemicals, so that's the mine side. On the chemical side, we're not diversified from China. So China have really taken ownership of the chemical side, which is for the batteries, and they now control 83% of the chemical side. So in terms of supply chain management, I think we could agree there's a fair old risk in the cobalt value chain. Another interesting thing to look at is how investment is coming in the EU. So the EU policy mandated growth, electric vehicles by 2025, 2030, 2035. How are we going to do it? If you just look on that right-hand side of the investments that are going to come in and the announcements we've seen to date, the really interesting thing is that change in the percentage of the world total. So how is Europe going to do? So at the moment, we've had this huge announcement on the actually cell manufacturing capability. They'll go from 7% of the world total this year to 33% by 2025. But if you look back down the value chain, we haven't got the equivalent investment in the facilitating bits of kit that you need. So the precursor, active material capacity, then the sulfate capacity, no lithium hydroxide yet, and tiny bits of cobalt coming out of Russia. She's losing ground on all the other areas. So even though you've built the cells to regionalise, that's not a genuine regionalisation strategy at the moment. There's still a way to go. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to click on capital availability. So I've got my last 3 slides now. This is where the governments are starting to put money in to try and help solve these issues of how the chains are built. On the left, this was a slightly old chart showing the US investment. I think we're on the yellow one being signed in. And you can see that there's a huge investment in transit and infrastructure that will be a strong pull on commodity demand. And on the right, you can see the EU next generation funds and the huge amount there that goes into the green transition. I've got another quick example on what that means. So here we have nickel. This is the US market for nickel, very similar to that picture I just showed for the EU. So can we have a nickel value chain in the US? Even if that government pays for it, is there enough? So we don't have much in the way of nickel mining, very, very tiny nickel sulfate production, and most of what currently is produced goes to other end uses, which is unlikely to be substituted away from. Don't really have the cobalt, although if first cobalt come on, we'll have some coming from Canada, and that will have to be imported. There's a little bit of manganese, and this is quite small volumes, so that might work. You can pull lithium in from some of the new projects, Canada and North America, but still need capital to be invested. Announcement by Tesla on the cathode active materials, and a few other juniors. Not much on the anode separator, electrolyte, etc. Small capacity outside Tesla for cells, and then just the battery pack EVs. So you really don't have the full route to market done. And I haven't done rare earths, but it looks mighty similar. You've got the mine at the beginning, nothing in the middle, and then the EVs at the end for the rare earths. So this is yet another example of where the challenges still sit. So to conclude, still challenges. It's really not obvious at the moment how the market will clear this. In terms of maintaining the long lean side of supply chains, you've got this Chinese head start, the possibility for them to export and continue their supply chains out into the rest of the world, to be the new Toyota. Investments maybe in the intermediate stages of the supply chains in EU and North America will help them catch up. But to be honest with you, at the moment we are still highly, highly reliant on China, and it will be long and potentially lean, but risky supply chains. In order to go to the resilient and local, we need to be able to quantify our emissions so we can report effectively. We need to be able to recycle effectively because that will be the future source of materials. And once we can do that, we're a lot more independent of the original mines. High levels of transparency. If the consumer demands that, it's going to be harder for China to come into our market. If we can be innovative in terms of how the production and processing routes are put in, maybe some of the capital can be reduced. And then this communication of the information up and down the chain so that we can get some efficiencies despite the speed and despite the changes would mean that we should eventually also be able to have resilient and local supply chains for these commodities and hopefully support the local industries. And that was it. Thank you very much.